Greetings and welcome again to the Gaming Codex, the show where I try to explain to you all the various terms used to describe video games and the video games industry. And today we have a really old one, the platformer. And what exactly is a platformer? Well, according to the general definition, platform video games are video games wherein players control a character by jumping or otherwise operating on physical, virtual platformers. This genre of video games is probably one of the oldest in existence, and it is still alive and kicking to this day. It's one of the most simple concepts possible. You, as a tiny blip on the screen, have to jump from one bit to another bit without falling in the middle bit and potentially having to restart from the first bit. The game considered as being one of the first fundamental examples of this genre is a title called Space Panic from 1980. Yes, that's 3 years after the release of the Atari 2600, 2 years before the release of Pitfall. Yes, the Atari 2600 existed for many years before actual good games were released for it. Now, Space Panic is a platformer in the basic sense of the genre because you do operate on platforms, you move between them via stairs, and you can fall from one platform to another, but there was no jump key. You did not have the ability to jump over obstacles. Instead, you had the ability to dig holes and hope that the obstacles, well, the enemies, would fall and die. You can, however, see where some of the core ideas of the genre came from. Donkey Kong, a more famous platformer and a more traditional one in the sense that we know now, being very similar to it in certain aspects. And very dissimilar in terms of one particular aspect. Donkey Kong actually sold, this one didn't. This one was an outright failure, and you can't understand why, because all you have to do is basically stand still and dig a hole, and the enemies will come to you. It wasn't a good game. And mind you, this was initially an arcade game, not an Atari game, so expectations were not that it would suck since the get-go. Now, what is the popular definition of a platformer game? Well, that would be a game where you jump on stuff like in Mario. And as well it should be, because Nintendo defined the platformer. It outright owned it. Donkey Kong was the beginning, but this genre was absolutely crystallized, solidified, set in stone, and perfectly mastered by the first Super Mario Bros. Game. That is an absolutely excellent game that just embodies the genre. You jump onto platforms, you jump onto enemies, you jump around and collect coins and do all sorts of other stuff like collect power-ups and finish levels and go to the right. These ideas were added to the genre by Nintendo through its constant development of its ever-expanding franchise of platforming games, which later would evolve into not just having linear ones like Mario, like Super Mario was, but having ones where you could go back, where you could change direction, where you could platform up and down, not just from left to right, like in Metroid. And Nintendo would continue to almost dominate the genre were it not for the opposition from Sega that pioneered its own brand of platformer, the fast action platformer, in the form of Sonic. But for the most part, you could clearly see the influence that Super Mario Bros. Had on the genre because most platformers that came after it were copies of it. Up until the 3D age when Nintendo just stole everything from Argonaut Games to make Super Mario 64. That's a fact. And of course, there is the cinematic platformer genre spawned by games like the first Prince of Persia game and Another World, which would later go on to spawn the core of the action-adventure game, which does include a lot of platforming, but they are not identified as being platformer games due to them including portions of combat that don't involve just jumping on things but shooting them, and the occasional puzzle with stuff you find lying around an ancient Mayan burial ground which you are currently raiding. Now, what would be the marketing definition of a platformer? Well, that is something that no one can sell now except for Nintendo. Some would say that the age of this genre has sort of passed because you do not see them made all that often outside of little tiny indie games, most of them with a retro aesthetic, or Nintendo games which look whatever Nintendo wants them to look like, and they will still sell because they are Nintendo games. They have a legacy behind them, and people expect a certain kind of gameplay, a certain kind of style from that developer, from those platforms, from that genre, from those franchises. Everyone else, though, they don't have as much luck. Some do a tiny bit, but not in the way they used to in the olden days. And it's not totally because the public has moved past beyond this, beyond platformers. It's also because people have sort of kind of a bit maybe not been doing some platformers like they should be doing them. They're doing them like they remember doing them. I'm referring, of course, to Ukulele, which is a game that's not as good as Snake Pass, honestly, which is a much better platformer, though Snake Pass wouldn't be a platformer if you control a snake and you don't... well, there are platforms in it, so I guess it would be. And so closes this edition of the Gaming Codex. Come back next time when we will talk about a brand new, different subject. Goodbye.